You think you know what prostitution looked like in medieval times? Of course you do. You've seen the movies, read the romanticized tales, imagined the mysterious courtesans in silk and velvet. But tonight, while you scroll through your dating apps and swipe left on faces you'll never remember, I'm going to show you what really happened in those narrow, reeking alleys of medieval cities. And when I'm done, you'll never look at the word consent the same way again. Picture this. It's 1347, and you're standing in the Southwark district of London. The Thames reeks of human waste and rotting fish, but that's not the worst smell hitting your nostrils. That honor belongs to the bathhouses, or, as the locals call them, the stews. These aren't spas, friend. These are brothels disguised as public baths. And the water? God, the water hasn't been changed in weeks. It's a soup of bodily fluids, disease, and desperation that would make modern sewage look appetizing. You see that girl over there? The one who can't be more than 14, standing in water up to her waist, her skin already showing the telltale sores of what they called the French disease back then. Syphilis, for those keeping score at home. She's been here for 3 months, ever since her father sold her to pay off a gambling debt. 3 months. In 3 more, she'll be dead, but not before she's infected dozens of men who will carry it home to their wives, their children, their entire bloodlines. But here's the thing that'll really twist your stomach. This was legal, regulated, encouraged, even. The church, those moral pillars of society, they owned many of these establishments. The Bishop of Winchester, that holy man of God, he was essentially a pimp on an industrial scale. His brothels stretched along the south bank of the Thames like a necklace of damnation, and every coin that dropped into a prostitute's palm had the church's blessing stamped right into it. You want to know how systematized this horror show was? They had licenses, official documents. The prostitutes were called Winchester geese, and they had to follow rules that would make your head spin. They couldn't work on Sundays or holy days because apparently God needed a break from profiting off human misery. They couldn't be married because that would interfere with their availability. And if they got pregnant, well, let's just say medieval birth control involved herbs that were more likely to kill the mother than prevent the pregnancy. The customers weren't just random perverts sneaking around in shadows. Oh no, they were pillars of society. Merchants who preached family values by day and bought children by night. Priests who took vows of celibacy but kept regular appointments at the stews. Knights who swore oaths of chivalry and honor while forcing themselves on women who had no choice but to submit or starve. And speaking of starving, let me paint you a picture of medieval economics that'll make your modern financial anxiety look like pocket change. A loaf of bread cost about a penny. A night with a prostitute? Also a penny. You see the problem here? Women weren't selling sex because it was lucrative. They were selling it because it was literally the only way to afford food. Starvation or violation, those were the options. Choose your poison. The living conditions? Imagine the worst slum you've ever seen, then multiply it by 10 and add the constant threat of violence. Most prostitutes lived in single rooms that they shared with 3 or 4 other women. No windows, no ventilation, just 4 walls, and the perpetual stench of unwashed bodies and sexual fluids. The floors were dirt, often mixed with straw that hadn't been changed in months. When it rained, everything turned to mud mixed with human waste that seeped up from the floor below. But the real nightmare wasn't the physical conditions, it was the psychological warfare. These women lived under constant threat of violence from customers, pimps, and the law itself. If a customer decided he didn't want to pay, there was no recourse. If he wanted to beat her half to death, well, that was just part of the service. If he killed her, the authorities might investigate if they felt like it, but more likely they'd just drag the body to the nearest ditch and forget it ever happened. The average lifespan of a medieval prostitute was about 5 years from the time she started working. 5 years. Most of them died before they turned 25, and not from old age. Disease, violence, botched abortions, suicide, these were the real causes of death. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones spent months wasting away from syphilis, their minds deteriorating as the disease ate away at their brains, their bodies covered in open sores that never healed. And here's where it gets really twisted. Society knew all of this. The church leaders, the merchants, the nobles, they all knew exactly what was happening in these places. They had detailed records, financial statements, medical reports. They knew about the disease rates, the mortality statistics, the ages of the girls being sold. And they didn't just tolerate it, they systematized it, regulated it, profited from it. The justification? Oh, this is rich. They claimed it was necessary to protect virtuous women. Better to have a class of disposable women absorbing men's base urges than risk them attacking good Christian wives and daughters. It was a sacrifice they were willing to make, as long as they weren't the ones being sacrificed. Sound familiar? It should, because we're still making the same calculations today, just with different window dressing. You think I'm exaggerating? Let me tell you about the papal brothels in Avignon. When the Pope moved his court there in the 14th century, he didn't just bring priests and administrators, he brought an entire sex industry, complete with official licenses and tax collectors. The Vatican, that symbol of moral authority, was running the most sophisticated prostitution ring in Europe. They kept detailed financial records, and those ledgers survive today. line item entries for entertainment expenses and hospitality services that would make a modern pimp blush. The women trapped in the system had no escape routes. If they tried to leave, they were hunted down and brought back. If they got sick, they were thrown out to die in the streets. If they got pregnant, they either had backroom abortions that often killed them, or they gave birth to children who were immediately sold into the same system. It was a perfect closed loop of human suffering, designed to extract maximum profit from minimum investment in human welfare. But here's what really happened to these women's minds, and this is where the historical records get truly disturbing. Many of them developed what we'd now recognize as severe dissociative disorders. They described feeling like they were floating outside their bodies, watching someone else endure the horrors. Some would speak of themselves in the third person, as if the woman being violated was someone else entirely. Others would create elaborate fantasy worlds in their minds, places they could retreat to when reality became unbearable. The medical texts from the period describe these symptoms as hysteria or melancholia. But reading between the lines, these were women suffering from severe trauma that would make modern PTSD look manageable. And the treatment? More abuse, often disguised as religious redemption. They'd be beaten to drive out the demons, starved to purify the soul, or subjected to primitive surgical procedures that were essentially torture with a medical excuse. Now here's the part that should really make your skin crawl. This wasn't some distant historical aberration. This was the foundation of European urban development. Every major medieval city had its red light district, and those districts were often the most economically productive areas in town. The taxes from prostitution funded churches, hospitals, schools, and civic improvements. The very stones of medieval civilization were mortared with the blood and tears of disposable women. And before you start feeling too superior about how far we've come, remember this. The structures that enabled this systematic brutalization of women didn't just disappear. They evolved, they adapted. They found new forms, new justifications, new ways to make the exploitation look like economics instead of evil. But this story isn't finished, not by a long shot, because what I've shown you so far is just the surface, the official version of events that made it into the historical records. The real horror, the part that the chroniclers couldn't stomach writing down, that's still coming. Next time, we're going deeper into the parts of medieval prostitution that were so brutal, so systematically cruel, that even a society comfortable with public executions and religious torture preferred to pretend they didn't exist. And when you see what's lurking in those shadows, you'll understand why some secrets stay buried for centuries. You'll also understand why they shouldn't. Remember that girl from the stews I told you about? The 14-year-old with syphilis sores? Well, she had a name once. Before the disease ate through her vocal cords, before the madness took hold, she used to whisper it to herself at night like a prayer. But names were luxuries in this business, and luxuries got beaten out of you fast. By the time the plague swept through London in 1348, she was just another corpse in the mass graves, unmarked and unmourned. But here's what the chroniclers didn't write down about her final months, what they couldn't bring themselves to document. She wasn't the worst case they'd seen. You want to know about the machinery of medieval prostitution? The real machinery, not the sanitized version that made it into the history books? Then let me tell you about the breaking-in process, the systematic destruction of human will that made the Roman Colosseum look like a children's playground. Because what happened to these women wasn't just exploitation. It was industrial-scale psychological warfare designed to create perfect victims. When a girl first arrived at the brothels, whether sold by her family or kidnapped off the streets, she'd spend her first week in what they called the teaching room. Sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Like she was learning to read or do arithmetic, but the only lesson being taught was submission, and the curriculum was written in blood and tears. They'd start with starvation, 3 or 4 days without food until her body began eating itself from the inside. Then came the introduction to her first customer, usually the most violent regular the establishment had. The goal wasn't pleasure or even profit from that first encounter. It was complete psychological destruction. The medical records from St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, the ones they kept locked away in the archives for centuries, describe the injuries these girls arrived with after their first week. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulders, internal bleeding that left them unable to walk. But the physical damage was just the beginning. The real destruction was happening in their minds, a careful dismantling of identity that would make modern psychological torture techniques look crude by comparison. Here's where it gets truly sickening. They had specialists for this. Men who made their living not from using these women, but from breaking them. They understood human psychology in ways that wouldn't be formally studied for another 500 years. They knew exactly how much pain to inflict, how much hope to offer and then snatch away, how to make a human being grateful for the smallest mercy while drowning in the deepest degradation. The techniques they used would make CIA interrogation manuals read like bedtime stories. Sensory deprivation, alternating between extreme heat and cold, forced drug addiction using a cocktail of opium and mercury that created both physical dependence and cognitive damage. But the most effective tool in their arsenal was something far more insidious. They would systematically destroy every connection these women had to their former lives. They'd start by changing their names, giving them working names that stripped away their family histories. Then they'd feed them false information about their families, telling them their parents had died or been arrested, that their siblings had forgotten them. Sometimes they'd even arrange for fake letters to be delivered, supposedly from family members, rejecting them as whores and devils. By the time they were done, these women believed they were truly alone in the world, that the brothel was the only family they had left. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. They were incredibly good at it. The psychological techniques they developed were so effective that many of these women would defend their captors against anyone who tried to help them. They'd attack other women who tried to escape, report escape plans to the brothel keepers, even recruit new girls into the system. It was Stockholm Syndrome perfected, 5 centuries before anyone had a name for it. The church records from this period, the ones hidden in Vatican archives that scholars only gained access to in the 1980s, reveal something even more disturbing. The clergy weren't just customers or owners of these establishments, they were consultants in the breaking process. Priests would use confession as a weapon, convincing these women that they were damned souls whose only path to salvation was complete submission to their fate. They'd quote scripture, twist biblical passages into justifications for the most horrific abuse, turn God himself into another tool of control. But the real genius of the system, the part that kept it running for centuries, was how it perpetuated itself. The women who survived long enough would eventually become madams, running new brothels and training new girls using the same techniques that had been used on them. It was trauma passed down like a family recipe, each generation perfecting the methods that had destroyed them. The cycle was so complete, so self-sustaining that it required no external force to maintain itself. The financial records from the Medici banks, those paragons of Renaissance culture and learning, show regular payments to training specialists and preparation consultants throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. These were legitimate business expenses, written off on tax documents right next to payments for silk and spices. The banks were financing the systematic destruction of human souls and treating it as just another cost of doing business. Now, let's talk about the customers, because they weren't just passive consumers in this machine of horror. They were active participants in the breaking process, and many of them paid extra for the privilege. There were special rates for first-time services, premium prices for the chance to be among the first to assault a newly arrived girl. Some customers would request specific types of trauma, particular forms of abuse that they'd developed as specialties. The brothel keepers would take notes, keeping detailed records of each customer's preferences so they could cater to their exact desires for cruelty. The guild records from various medieval cities show that many of these customers were guild masters themselves, respected members of the community who held positions of authority and trust, blacksmiths who made the chains used to restrain the women, carpenters who built the special furniture used in the worst rooms, physicians who provided medical care designed not to heal, but to keep the women functional enough to continue working while maximizing their suffering. And the legal system? Oh, they weren't just complicit, they were enthusiastic participants. Judges would sentence women to forced prostitution for crimes as minor as stealing bread or speaking back to their husbands. Constables would round up runaway girls and deliver them directly to the brothels, collecting bounties for each successful capture. The entire justice system was just another arm of the sex trafficking machine, dressed up in legal language and moral justification. The torture techniques they used in these places would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. They had devices specifically designed to cause maximum pain while leaving no permanent marks that would reduce the women's value. Pressure points that could cause excruciating agony without visible injury. Drugs that could make someone feel like they were dying while keeping them fully conscious and aware. Methods of sexual assault that were designed to cause psychological rather than physical damage, leaving the victims functional but completely broken inside. But here's what really happened to the children born in these places, and this is where the historical record gets so dark that most scholars refuse to discuss it publicly. The babies born to prostitutes weren't just abandoned or killed, though many were. The ones who survived were raised inside the brothels, trained from infancy to accept abuse as normal, to see violence as affection, to understand that their only value came from their ability to please others through their own degradation. These children, girls and boys both, were living experiments in human conditioning. They were raised in environments where rape was routine, where violence was love, where submission was survival. By the time they reached adolescence, they weren't just broken. They were perfectly calibrated instruments of abuse, trained to perpetuate the system that had created them. The boys often became pimps and brothel keepers. The girls became the next generation of prostitutes, but ones who required no breaking-in period because they'd been broken from birth. The medical experiments conducted on these women, in the name of treating their conditions, would have made Nazi doctors proud. Primitive lobotomies using hot iron rods pushed through the eye socket, chemical castrations using mercury and lead compounds, surgical procedures performed without any form of anesthesia, designed to increase pleasure for customers rather than provide any medical benefit. The physicians who performed these procedures kept detailed notes, treating human beings like laboratory animals in experiments that served no purpose beyond satisfying sadistic curiosity. And all of this, every single horrific detail, was documented. recorded, filed away in archives and account books and medical journals. The people running the system weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were businessmen keeping careful records of their investments. They tracked mortality rates, profit margins, customer satisfaction scores. They treated human suffering as a commodity to be optimized, a resource to be exploited as efficiently as possible. But this machinery of flesh had one weakness, one crack in its perfect design that the operators never saw coming. Some of these women, despite everything that had been done to them, maintained a tiny spark of humanity buried so deep that even the most sophisticated torture couldn't reach it. And that spark, that refusal to be completely extinguished, that's where the real story begins. Because what happened when these broken women found each other, when they started to remember who they'd been before the machine got hold of them, that's when the medieval world encountered something it had never seen before, organized resistance from the very bottom of society. But that's a story the chroniclers definitely didn't want preserved. That's a story so dangerous that even mentioning it could get you branded a heretic and burned alive. Next time, I'll tell you about the networks these women built, the codes they developed, the ways they fought back against a system designed to make resistance impossible. And when you understand how they did it, you'll realize that the techniques they developed are still being used today by people fighting against systems that would rather pretend they don't exist. You remember that spark I mentioned? That tiny flame of humanity that even the most sophisticated torture couldn't extinguish? Well, in 1356, in a brothel basement beneath the streets of Paris, something happened that the authorities spent decades trying to erase from every record they could find. A woman known only as Margot the Silent did something that shouldn't have been possible for someone in her position. She spoke. And when she spoke, she didn't scream or beg or confess to sins she'd never committed. She whispered a single word that would spread through the underground networks like wildfire. Remember. See, what the brothel keepers and church officials and civic authorities never understood was that breaking a human being completely is actually impossible. You can destroy their will, crush their spirit, make them forget their names and their families and their dreams, but buried deeper than conscious thought, deeper than memory itself, something always survives. And when that something finds another spark, another survivor, another woman who refuses to be completely erased, they start to glow together. And that glow, friend, that's when the real nightmare begins for the people in power. The first networks weren't organized resistance in any way you'd recognize. They were simpler, more primal. A system of subtle signals that warned of particularly violent customers. A way of sharing herbs that could induce miscarriages before pregnancies became obvious. Methods of hiding small amounts of coin where the madams couldn't find them. These weren't revolutionary acts. They were survival instincts made communal. But survival, when it's shared among the desperate, has a way of evolving into something more dangerous. The coded language they developed was so sophisticated that modern linguists are still trying to decode some of the fragments that survived in court records. They used flower arrangements to communicate danger levels, different types of knots in their hair to signal which customers were diseased, patterns of scratches on windowsills that indicated safe routes out of the district. This wasn't just communication, it was the birth of a shadow language that could carry information through a world designed to keep them isolated and ignorant. But here's where it gets really interesting, and really terrifying for the authorities. These women started to remember things, not just their own experiences, but stories passed down from older prostitutes, fragments of information about the system that controlled them. They began to piece together the financial networks, the political connections, the religious justifications. They started to understand that they weren't just victims of individual cruelty, but cogs in a machine that reached all the way to the highest levels of medieval society. The church records from Notre Dame, the ones sealed in the restricted archives that scholars need special permission to access, contain confession notes from priests who were troubled by what they were hearing. Women were coming to confession not to seek forgiveness for their sins, but to gather information. They'd confess to fake transgressions, elaborate fictional sins that would prompt the priests to reveal details about the brothel operations, the financial arrangements, the political protections that kept the system running. These women were using the sacrament of confession as an intelligence-gathering operation, and they were learning things that made them incredibly dangerous. They discovered that certain noble families had contracts guaranteeing them first access to new girls, that some merchants were using the brothels as collateral for loans, literally mortgaging human beings to secure business deals, that church officials were skimming money from the brothel profits to fund private armies and political campaigns. This wasn't just a sex trade, it was a financial and political network that underpinned the entire power structure of medieval Europe. The most dangerous discovery they made was about the children. Remember those kids raised in the brothels, the ones trained from birth to accept abuse as normal? Well, some of these women started to realize that these children could be saved. Not all of them, not easily, but it was possible. And once they understood that, once they saw that the cycle could be broken, everything changed. Because saving children requires planning, coordination, resources. It requires the kind of organized resistance that could threaten the entire system. The first documented rescue operation took place in Bruges in 1363. The records were almost completely destroyed. But fragments survive in the archives of the Hanseatic League, buried in trade documents where no one thought to look for them. A group of prostitutes managed to smuggle 12 children out of the brothel district during a religious festival, when security was focused on controlling crowds rather than watching for escapes. The children were hidden in merchant wagons and transported to convents in distant cities, where sympathetic nuns would raise them under false identities. But the authorities' response to this operation reveals just how terrified they were of organized resistance from this quarter. They didn't just punish the women they caught, they implemented what can only be described as a reign of terror. Mass executions, public tortures designed to send a message, the complete destruction of entire brothel districts, followed by their rebuilding with enhanced security measures. The message was clear. Individual suffering we can tolerate, but collective action threatens everything. The torture methods they used on captured resistance members went far beyond anything they'd used before. These weren't just punishments. They were information extraction techniques designed to identify and destroy the entire network. They used psychological torture that makes modern interrogation look humane, forcing women to watch other members of their network being tortured, using their own rescue plans against them by threatening to harm the children they'd tried to save, creating elaborate deceptions that made them believe their friends had betrayed them. But here's what the authorities never understood. Trauma shared is trauma that can be survived. The same women who'd been broken by isolation and individual torture found strength in collective suffering. They developed support systems that could sustain them through even the most sophisticated psychological warfare. They created rituals, ceremonies, ways of honoring their dead and maintaining hope for their living. They became more than just a resistance network. They became a culture. The coded manuscripts they produced, written in cipher and hidden in places where authority figures would never think to look, contained some of the most sophisticated political analysis of the medieval period. These women understood power structures in ways that political theorists wouldn't formally articulate for centuries. They wrote about the connections between sexual violence and political control, about how the dehumanization of women served broader systems of oppression, about the ways that economic exploitation required social and religious justification. And they weren't just analyzing the system, they were actively undermining it. They developed techniques for spreading venereal diseases selectively, targeting the most powerful customers while protecting lower-level clients who showed them kindness. They created networks for sharing information about political secrets they'd overheard during intimate encounters, intelligence that could be used to blackmail or manipulate important figures. They turned their positions at the bottom of society into surveillance posts that gave them access to the most sensitive information in the medieval world. The assassination attempts were the most carefully guarded secret of all. The church records that mention them were written in code and scattered across different archives, but when you piece them together, a pattern emerges. Between 1370 and 1420, at least 15 high-ranking church officials, nobles and merchants who were heavily involved in the sex trade, died under suspicious circumstances. Poison was the most common method, administered by women who had intimate access to their targets. These weren't random acts of revenge. They were carefully coordinated operations designed to disrupt the financial and political networks that sustained the system. But the most sophisticated operation they ran was the information network. These women had access to pillow talk from some of the most powerful men in Europe. Trade secrets, military plans, political alliances, financial arrangements, family scandals, all of it whispered into the ears of women who were considered too broken and worthless to be security risks. They began selling this information, not for personal profit, but to fund their resistance operations. They became medieval spies, using their sexual exploitation as cover for intelligence gathering that could topple governments. The authorities' response, when they finally understood what they were facing, was to implement security measures that wouldn't look out of place in a modern totalitarian state. Constant surveillance, informants planted within the prostitute communities, regular loyalty tests designed to identify potential resistance members. They started moving women between different brothels regularly to prevent them from forming lasting bonds. They implemented collective punishment systems where the entire population of a brothel would be punished for the actions of any individual. They turned the entire sex trade into a prison system designed to prevent any form of collective action. But by then, it was too late. The networks had already spread too far, become too sophisticated, developed too many safeguards. The resistance had learned to adapt to every countermeasure, to find new ways of communicating and organizing that stayed ahead of the authorities' understanding. They'd created something that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a ghost organization that could strike without warning and then disappear back into the shadows of society's most despised population. The really terrifying part, from the authorities' perspective, was that this resistance was beginning to connect with other marginalized groups. Jewish communities facing persecution, peasants planning revolts, heretical religious movements, all of them started receiving support and intelligence from the prostitute networks. The women who'd been written off as the dregs of society were becoming the communications backbone for every form of resistance in medieval Europe. And here's the part that should keep you awake at night, the part that explains why these records were buried so deeply that historians are still finding fragments of them today. This resistance network never really died. It adapted, evolved, found new forms and new methods. The techniques they developed for operating under total surveillance, for maintaining solidarity under conditions of extreme isolation, for turning the tools of oppression into weapons of resistance, all of that knowledge was passed down through generations of marginalized women who learned that survival requires more than just individual endurance. You want to know why the authorities were so terrified of these networks that they spent centuries trying to erase every trace of them? Because they proved that even the most comprehensive system of oppression has weaknesses, that even the most broken human beings can find ways to fight back, that solidarity can emerge from the deepest despair, and that when it does, it's more dangerous to established power than any army or political movement. The final coded message that's been deciphered, found carved into the walls of a demolished brothel in Venice, translates roughly to, "They think we are nothing because they made us nothing, but nothing has no limits, and nothing has nothing to lose." That message was carved sometime in the 1480s, just as the Renaissance was beginning to reshape European culture. But the women who carved it understood something that all the great thinkers and artists of that era never grasped, that true revolution doesn't come from above, it comes from below, and it comes from the people who have been so thoroughly destroyed by the system that they have no choice but to rebuild themselves into something the system never imagined possible. Next time, I'll tell you about what happened when these networks finally went public, when they stopped hiding in shadows and started demanding not just their own freedom, but the complete transformation of the society that had created them. Because that's when medieval Europe encountered something that made the Black Death look like a minor inconvenience. Organized women who refused to stay silent about what had been done to them, and who had spent generations learning exactly how to bring down the people responsible. Picture this. It's Easter Sunday, 1429, and you're standing in the central square of Toulouse. The entire city has gathered for the most important religious celebration of the year, the resurrection of Christ, the triumph of good over evil. The cathedral bells are ringing, the incense is burning, and the bishop is preparing to deliver his sermon about redemption and salvation. But something's wrong. There's a sound coming from the crowd, a low murmur that doesn't belong in a holy celebration. And then you see them, women in red robes, dozens of them, walking through the crowd in perfect formation, their faces uncovered despite laws that required prostitutes to hide their identities in public. They're not here to worship. They're here to testify. What happened in Toulouse that day was the culmination of over a century of underground organization, the moment when the invisible networks of resistance finally broke the surface and showed medieval Europe what they'd really been building in the shadows. It wasn't just a protest or a demonstration. It was a coordinated assault on the entire system of sexual exploitation that had been the foundation of urban life for generations. And the authorities' response to it would reshape European society in ways that historians are still afraid to discuss openly. The planning for what they called the Great Testimony had taken 15 years. Every detail had been coordinated through the cipher networks. Every contingency had been planned for. Every possible response from the authorities had been anticipated. This wasn't the desperate act of broken women lashing out at their oppressors. This was a military operation conducted by an army that had been training in secret for decades, an army that knew their enemy better than the enemy knew themselves, because they'd been living inside the enemy's most intimate spaces for generations. The women who stood up in that cathedral weren't just from Toulouse. They'd traveled from across France, from the Low Countries, from the Italian city-states, from as far away as London and Prague. The underground networks had coordinated the largest movement of people in medieval Europe since the Crusades, and they'd done it completely invisibly, using the same trade routes and travel documents that their oppressors used to transport them between brothels. They'd turned the machinery of their own exploitation into the logistics system for their liberation. When the first woman began to speak, her voice carried across the square with a clarity that made the cathedral bells sound like whispers. She didn't speak in the broken dialect of the brothels or the submissive tones that customers expected. She spoke in perfect Latin, the language of education and authority, the language that women of her class were never supposed to learn. And what she said in that clear, educated voice was designed to destroy not just individual reputations, but the entire intellectual framework that justified the exploitation of women. She began by naming names, not just customers, but the entire network of financial and political relationships that sustained the sex trade. She recited loan agreements between noble families and brothel keepers, detailed the church's investment portfolios that included shares in prostitution operations, described the tax collection systems that turned sexual exploitation into civic revenue. She spoke for 2 hours without notes, presenting a financial audit of medieval Europe's power structure that was more comprehensive than anything the authorities themselves possessed. But the financial details were just the opening act. The real destruction began when she started reading from the letters. Letters between bishops discussing the moral necessity of maintaining brothels. Letters between merchants arranging for the transport of children between cities. Letters between nobles bidding on exclusive access to particular women like they were trading livestock. Letters between physicians detailing the medical experiments they'd conducted on prostitutes without consent. Every piece of correspondence had been carefully copied and preserved by women who'd learned to read by stealing scraps of education from the very people who were exploiting them. The authorities' first response was predictable. They tried to arrest the speakers for disturbing the peace. But that's when they discovered the second phase of the operation. Every constable who moved toward the women found his path blocked by other members of the crowd, citizens who'd been carefully positioned throughout the square. These weren't random supporters. They were people who'd been systematically recruited and organized over years. Former customers who'd been blackmailed into cooperation. Merchants whose financial secrets the networks had discovered. Even some clergy who'd been convinced that their souls depended on supporting this testimony. The third speaker was different from the first two. She was younger, maybe 17, and when she spoke, it wasn't in Latin but in the common dialect that everyone could understand. She told her story simply, directly, without the elaborate language or complex financial details that had characterized the earlier testimonies. She talked about being sold by her father when she was 12. She described her first night in the brothel, the systematic breaking process, the customers who paid extra to hurt her. She spoke about the diseases she'd contracted, the pregnancies that had been terminated with herbs that nearly killed her, the friends who died from violence or suicide or simply from giving up. But here's what made her testimony truly dangerous. She connected every individual horror to the broader system. She explained how her suffering had generated profit for specific individuals, how those profits had been invested in legitimate businesses, how those businesses had supported political campaigns and religious institutions. She made it impossible for anyone listening to pretend that the brutalization of women was somehow separate from the society they lived in, that it was an unfortunate byproduct rather than a fundamental requirement of medieval civilization. The fourth speaker revealed the assassination network. Standing in front of the most powerful people in southern France, she calmly listed the names of 15 men who died over the previous 50 years, described exactly how they'd been killed, and explained why each death had been necessary for the survival of the resistance network. She detailed poison formulas, described seduction techniques used to get close to targets, explained how information gathered during intimate encounters had been used to plan the killings. She turned murder into political testimony, violence into historical record. By the time the fifth speaker began, the authorities had realized they were facing something unprecedented in European history. This wasn't just a protest or even a rebellion. It was a complete exposure of the hidden foundations of medieval society. The networks had documented everything, preserved every piece of evidence, recorded every conversation. They'd created a parallel archive of medieval history, one that told the story from the perspective of the people at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. And now they were making that archive public, forcing society to confront the reality of what it had built on the backs of disposable women. The church's response was to declare the entire gathering heretical and call for immediate intervention by secular authorities. But that's when they discovered that the networks had anticipated this move too. The sixth speaker was a former nun, a woman who'd been sold to a convent by her family and had discovered the connections between religious institutions and the sex trade. She read from documents she'd stolen from Vatican archives, papal bulls that explicitly authorized the operation of brothels, financial records showing the church's investment in human trafficking, correspondence between high-ranking clergy discussing the theological necessity of maintaining a class of sexually available women. The secular authorities tried to disperse the crowd by force, but that's when they encountered the most sophisticated aspect of the resistance. The crowd itself had been organized as a defensive formation. Every person in the square had been given specific instructions about how to respond to different types of intervention. When soldiers moved in from one direction, the crowd would shift and flow like water, protecting the speakers while avoiding direct confrontation. When authorities tried to arrest specific individuals, they found themselves facing coordinated resistance from dozens of people who seemed to know exactly what to do. The seventh speaker revealed the information network that had made all of this possible. She described how prostitutes had been systematically gathering intelligence on their customers for decades, how they'd used their access to private conversations and personal secrets to build detailed profiles of everyone involved in the exploitation system. She explained how this information had been used not just for blackmail and assassination, but for broader political manipulation. The networks had been influencing elections, steering trade agreements, shaping diplomatic relationships, all by leveraging the secrets they'd learned in brothel bedrooms across Europe. But the most devastating testimony came from the eighth speaker, a woman who'd been born in a brothel and raised within the system until she was 15. She spoke about the children, not just her own experience, but the systematic cultivation of human beings for sexual exploitation. She described the conditioning techniques that had been used on her and her peers, the psychological methods that had been developed to create perfect victims. She explained how some children had been selected for special training, raised to be spies and infiltrators who could operate in noble courts and religious institutions. And then she revealed the scope of the operation. The networks hadn't just been operating in brothels. They'd been placing women in convents and noble households and merchant families. Some of the most trusted servants, most pious nuns, most loyal wives in medieval Europe had been trained from childhood to gather information and report back to the resistance networks. The prostitution system hadn't just been exploiting women, it had been the recruiting ground for the most extensive espionage operation in European history. The authorities' final desperate move was to bring in military forces from outside the city, soldiers who wouldn't be compromised by local connections to the networks. But that's when they discovered the true scope of what they were facing. The networks had spread far beyond the sex trade, far beyond individual cities, far beyond even national boundaries. When word of the Toulouse testimony spread, similar gatherings began appearing in dozens of cities across Europe. Women emerged from shadows in Paris, London, Venice, Prague, revealing that what everyone had assumed was a local uprising was actually a coordinated continental revolution. The information that emerged from these testimonies didn't just threaten individual careers or even specific institutions. It threatened the entire conceptual framework of medieval society. The networks had documented connections between sexual exploitation and every other form of oppression in European civilization. They'd shown how the brutalization of women was connected to the persecution of Jews, how the dehumanization required for prostitution was the same mindset that enabled serfdom, how the financial systems that profited from sexual slavery were identical to those that sustained political tyranny. What made all of this truly terrifying for the authorities was that the networks weren't demanding reform or regulation or better treatment within the existing system. They were demanding the complete dismantling of medieval civilization as it had been constructed. They'd seen how deeply the exploitation of women was embedded in every aspect of European society, and they understood that you couldn't eliminate sexual slavery without eliminating the entire social, economic, and political structure that required it. The final speaker in Toulouse, an elderly woman who'd survived in the system for over 30 years, delivered what became known as the prophecy of the damned. She predicted that the resistance would continue to grow, that the networks would continue to spread, that eventually the hidden foundations of European society would collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. She predicted religious wars, political revolutions, the overthrow of monarchies, the emergence of new forms of government based on principles that medieval civilization couldn't even imagine. And she was right. Within 50 years, Europe would be convulsed by religious warfare that would reshape the continent. Within 2 centuries, political revolutions would overthrow the old order. Within 5 centuries, the entire feudal system would collapse and be replaced by forms of government that recognized, at least in principle, the fundamental equality of human beings. The women who stood up in Toulouse in 1429 weren't just protesting their own exploitation, they were announcing the end of the medieval world. But here's what the historians don't want you to understand. This transformation didn't happen because of the great men and famous events you learned about in school. It happened because the most marginalized, most brutalized, most invisible people in medieval society had spent generations building the organizational structures and intellectual frameworks that would eventually destroy the civilization that had created them. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the democratic revolutions, all of them had their roots in the resistance networks that emerged from medieval brothels. Next time, I'll tell you about the aftermath, about what happened to the women who dared to speak truth to power, and about how the authorities' response to their testimony would create the very conditions that would eventually fulfill their prophecy. Because the real horror of this story isn't what was done to these women in the past, it's how the patterns they identified are still operating today, still creating the same cycles of exploitation and resistance, still demanding the same choice between complicity and revolution. You want to know what happens when you threaten the foundations of civilization itself? When you expose the hidden machinery that keeps the powerful in power and the powerless in chains? Let me tell you about the year that followed the Great Testimony, the 12 months that medieval Europe spent trying to stuff a revelation back into the darkness where it belonged. It was a year that would make the Spanish Inquisition look like a mild disagreement about theology, a year that would demonstrate exactly how much violence the establishment was willing to commit to protect its secrets. The first executions began 3 days after the Toulouse testimony, not public executions, mind you. Those would have drawn attention, created martyrs, possibly inspired more resistance. No, these were quiet disappearances, women who simply vanished from the streets and were never seen again. The authorities had learned from the network's own tactics. If you want to destroy something, you do it invisibly, systematically, without leaving evidence that could be used against you later. But here's what they didn't understand about the women they were hunting. These weren't isolated individuals who could be picked off one by one. They were part of a living organism that had spent decades developing immunity to exactly this kind of attack. Every woman who disappeared had prepared for that possibility, had left behind coded messages that would continue her work, had trained others to carry on her specific role in the networks. Killing them didn't weaken the resistance. It activated dormant cells that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The church's response was particularly creative. They couldn't simply execute women for heresy without trials, and trials would have meant public testimony, which was exactly what they were trying to prevent. So they developed what they called purification protocols. Women suspected of involvement in the networks would be arrested on charges of witchcraft. subjected to intensive interrogation designed to extract confessions of supernatural activity rather than political resistance, then burned alive for consorting with demons rather than for exposing systematic exploitation. The torture methods they used during these interrogations were specifically designed to destroy memory and identity. They discovered that traditional torture was ineffective against women who'd already survived the brothel breaking process, so they developed new techniques focused on psychological rather than physical destruction. Sensory deprivation chambers that would drive someone insane within days, drugs that would cause vivid hallucinations and make victims question their own memories. Isolation techniques that could break down personality structure and leave someone unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy. But the most insidious part of the purification protocols was how they turned the women's own organizational skills against them. Interrogators would pretend to be fellow resistance members who'd been captured, would share real intelligence that had been obtained through previous interrogations, would convince women that the only way to protect their networks was to provide information about other members. They created elaborate deceptions that made cooperation look like resistance and betrayal look like loyalty. The secular authorities developed their own approach, one that was arguably even more brutal because it was more efficient. They implemented what they called collective responsibility. Whenever evidence of network activity was discovered in any location, they would execute not just the suspected resistance members, but everyone associated with them. Entire brothels would be burned with everyone inside. Whole neighborhoods where prostitutes had lived would be cleared and the residents sold into slavery or indentured servitude in distant regions. The financial warfare was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the countercamp. The networks had built their resistance on carefully accumulated resources, coins hidden in secret locations, investments made through intermediaries, property acquired under false names. The authorities launched a comprehensive campaign to identify and seize these assets, using the same intelligence techniques that the networks had developed, but turning them against their creators. They offered massive rewards for information about hidden resources, turned former allies into informants, systematically dismantled the economic foundation that had made resistance possible. But here's where the authorities made their fatal error. They assumed that the networks operated like traditional political organizations, with hierarchies and command structures and centralized leadership that could be targeted and destroyed. They spent enormous resources hunting for the leaders of the resistance, torturing captured women to reveal the identities of their commanders, following money trails to find the central coordination points. They never understood that they were fighting something that had no center, no hierarchy, no single point of failure that could be eliminated. The networks had learned from centuries of persecution and oppression. They'd structured themselves as a distributed organism, with each cell capable of independent operation, but connected to others through bonds that were cultural and emotional rather than organizational. You couldn't destroy them by killing their leaders because they had no leaders in any traditional sense. You couldn't break them by severing communication lines because they communicated through methods that were embedded in daily life, invisible to outsiders but perfectly clear to those who knew how to read them. The authorities' campaign of repression lasted 18 months and claimed an estimated 12,000 lives. Not just the women who'd been involved in the networks, but their families, their friends, their customers, anyone who might have had knowledge of the resistance activities. It was genocide, disguised as law enforcement, systematic extermination presented as moral purification. But when the smoke cleared and the bodies were buried, the authorities discovered something that filled them with a terror deeper than anything they'd experienced during the initial testimonies. The networks were still there, changed, evolved, adapted to the new conditions, but fundamentally intact. The massive campaign of repression had done exactly what the resistance had predicted it would do. It had created the conditions for its own escalation. Every woman executed became a martyr whose story inspired others. Every family destroyed created new recruits, hungry for revenge. Every act of brutality demonstrated the validity of the network's core argument, that the system was irredeemably corrupt and had to be completely destroyed. The documentation from this period, scattered across dozens of archives and written in codes that took historians centuries to break, reveals something even more disturbing than the scale of the violence. The authorities knew they were losing. Internal correspondence between church officials, diplomatic messages between secular rulers, military reports from commanders involved in the repression campaigns, all of them acknowledge that the resistance was growing stronger rather than weaker, that the networks were spreading faster than they could be destroyed, that traditional methods of social control were becoming ineffective against an enemy that seemed to anticipate and counter every move. The most telling document is a letter from the Bishop of Paris to the Pope, written in 1431 and sealed with instructions that it should never be opened except in the event of the complete collapse of Christian civilization in Europe. In it, the bishop admits that the church's involvement in sexual exploitation had created an enemy more dangerous than any heresy, more persistent than any plague, more destructive than any foreign invasion. He acknowledges that the networks had learned our methods better than we know them ourselves, and had turned our own weapons against us with a skill that suggests supernatural assistance. But the supernatural assistance wasn't demonic. It was simply the result of applied intelligence and shared experience. The women in these networks had survived things that would have broken most people completely. They'd learned to think strategically under conditions of extreme stress, to plan long-term while living day to day, to maintain hope in situations of absolute despair. They'd developed skills that made them incredibly dangerous opponents, and the authorities' repression campaign had given them the motivation to use those skills without restraint. The evolution of the networks during this period is documented in the coded messages that survived the purges, and what those messages reveal would have given medieval authorities nightmares if they'd been able to decode them at the time. The resistance had stopped thinking defensively and started planning offensive operations on a scale that dwarfed anything they'd attempted before. They weren't just trying to survive or escape anymore, they were actively working to destroy the entire system that had created their suffering. The assassination network expanded from individual targets to coordinated campaigns designed to eliminate entire power structures. They developed new methods of poison that could kill slowly and untraceably, making deaths look like natural causes, but timing them to cause maximum disruption to political and economic systems. They created false flag operations that would make different factions of the establishment turn against each other. They infiltrated religious institutions at the highest levels, placing agents in positions where they could influence church policy and redirect resources away from repression campaigns. But the most sophisticated development was what they called the Long Revolution. Rather than trying to overthrow the system immediately, they began working to transform it from within over generations. They placed their children and grandchildren in positions throughout society, not as prostitutes, but as servants, nuns, merchants' wives, even minor nobility in some cases. These sleeper agents would spend decades establishing themselves as respected members of society while secretly working to undermine the foundations of medieval civilization. The generational planning that went into this strategy is breathtaking in its scope and patience. They understood that the system they were fighting had taken centuries to develop and would take centuries to dismantle. They created educational programs that would ensure their descendants would have the skills and knowledge necessary to continue the work. They developed cultural traditions that would preserve the memory of their suffering and the commitment to justice across multiple generations. They built institutions disguised as charitable organizations that would provide resources and coordination for future resistance efforts. The authorities gradually realized they were fighting something unlike anything in European history. This wasn't a peasant revolt that could be crushed with military force, or a religious heresy that could be eliminated through theological argument and selective execution. This was a fundamental challenge to the entire conceptual framework of medieval society, conducted by people who understood that system better than its own creators, because they'd experienced its contradictions from the bottom up. The psychological warfare reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. The networks began spreading rumors designed to create paranoia among the ruling classes, stories about infiltration and betrayal that would make powerful men suspicious of their closest allies. They planted evidence of corruption and conspiracy that would trigger internal power struggles within the establishment. They created fake resistance cells designed to draw out and identify government informants, then fed those informants false information that would lead to wasteful and counterproductive repression efforts. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in their arsenal was simply truth itself. The networks had documented everything, preserved every piece of evidence, recorded every testimony. They understood that their most powerful weapon wasn't violence or sabotage, but simply forcing society to confront the reality of what it had built. They began systematically releasing information about the connections between respected institutions and sexual exploitation, timing these revelations to cause maximum damage to the credibility of the establishment. The cumulative effect of these revelations was to create a crisis of legitimacy that would ultimately prove more destructive than any military campaign. When people began to understand how deeply the exploitation of women was embedded in every aspect of medieval civilization, when they realized that their churches, their governments, their economic systems were all built on systematic brutalization of the most vulnerable members of society, the entire intellectual foundation of the medieval world began to collapse. And that collapse, friend, that's when things got really interesting. Because when a civilization loses faith in its own moral foundations, when the contradictions between its stated values and its actual practices become too obvious to ignore, that's when everything becomes possible. Revolution, Reformation, Renaissance, all of it emerges from moments when the hidden brutalities of a system become visible to the people who'd been taught to believe in its nobility. The women who'd started this process by speaking truth in a cathedral square had understood something that their oppressors never did, that systems built on lies will eventually be destroyed by truth, that power based on hidden violence will eventually be undermined by exposure, that the very brutality required to maintain an unjust system will eventually create the conditions for its own destruction. But this story has one more chapter, one final revelation that will make everything else you've heard seem like preparation for the real horror. Because what happened to these women, what they learned, what they built, none of it stayed in the past. The patterns they identified, the techniques they developed, the organizational structures they created, all of it evolved, adapted, found new forms in new centuries. And if you know how to look, if you understand the signs they left behind, you can see their descendants operating today, still fighting the same fight, still using the same methods, still working toward the same ultimate goal. Next time, I'll show you how to recognize them in the modern world, how to see the connections between medieval resistance networks and contemporary power structures, how to understand that the war they started has never ended. It's just moved to new battlefields and found new weapons. And when you see those connections, when you understand how little has really changed beneath the surface, you'll realize that everything they predicted about the future has already come true. We're living in the world they created through their resistance, but we're also still living with the systems they were fighting against. The only question is which side of that eternal conflict you're going to choose. You thought this was a history lesson, didn't you? A disturbing glimpse into a brutal past that we've thankfully left behind. A reminder of how far we've come since those dark medieval days. But here's the thing that's going to keep you awake tonight. The truth that's going to make you look at your modern world with completely different eyes. Nothing ended. The networks those women built, the techniques they developed, the war they started, it's all still here, still operating, still fighting the same battles with the same enemies, using evolved versions of the same methods. You want proof? Let's start with something simple, something you've probably never connected to medieval prostitution, but should have. That app on your phone, the one you use to swipe through faces like you're shopping for merchandise, the algorithmic systems that determine who gets matched with whom, the profit models that monetize human loneliness and sexual desire, the psychological manipulation techniques that keep users engaged and spending money. All of that has its roots in the systematic commodification of human sexuality that began in those medieval brothels. The business model is identical. Identify vulnerable populations, create systems that exploit their basic human needs, maximize profit while minimizing investment in human welfare, use technology and psychology to make the exploitation seem voluntary. The medieval brothel keepers would recognize every element of modern dating platforms, from the premium pricing for better access to the psychological techniques used to create addiction to the careful maintenance of user desperation that keeps the money flowing. But that's just the surface level, the obvious connection that doesn't require much analysis to understand. The real continuities run much deeper, into the fundamental structures of how power operates in the modern world. Remember those networks of financial and political relationships that sustained medieval prostitution? Those networks didn't disappear. They evolved. They found new forms, new justifications, new ways of hiding their operations behind legitimate business and political activities. The modern sex trafficking industry operates using organizational structures that are direct descendants of medieval systems. The same combination of legitimate businesses providing cover for illegal activities, the same integration with mainstream financial institutions, the same connections to political power that provide protection from prosecution, the same psychological techniques for breaking and controlling victims, refined over centuries but fundamentally unchanged in their methods and goals. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The resistance techniques developed by those medieval networks are also still in use, still being passed down through informal channels, still being adapted to new conditions and new technologies. The coded communication systems, the distributed organizational structures, the long-term strategic thinking, the use of infiltration and intelligence gathering, all of it survived, all of it evolved, all of it is still operating today. You see them in the modern world if you know how to look. Women's organizations that seem to focus on charitable work but actually function as intelligence networks, tracking and documenting patterns of abuse across multiple institutions. Survivor networks that appear to be support groups but actually coordinate sophisticated campaigns to expose and undermine exploitative systems. Online communities that look like social platforms but actually serve as recruiting and training grounds for contemporary resistance operations. The descendants of those medieval networks understand something that most people never grasp, that the systems of exploitation they're fighting aren't bugs in the modern world, they're features. They're not accidental byproducts of otherwise beneficial institutions. They're fundamental requirements for how power operates in any society built on inequality. And they know that you can't reform or regulate or vote your way out of systems that depend on exploitation for their basic functioning. The techniques they use today would be familiar to their medieval predecessors, adapted for digital environments, but based on the same principles. They infiltrate online platforms and use them to gather intelligence on traffickers and exploiters. They create false identities to document criminal activities and gather evidence for later use. They use social media to spread awareness and recruit new members, but they do it in ways that are invisible to the authorities who are trying to track them. The financial warfare has evolved too. Modern resistance networks understand how to use the complexity of global financial systems against themselves, how to trace money flows that connect legitimate businesses to exploitation operations, how to identify the pressure points where economic sabotage can cause maximum damage to trafficking networks. They've learned to use cryptocurrency and other new technologies, not just to hide their own operations, but to disrupt the financial infrastructure that supports modern slavery. But the most sophisticated evolution is in the area of information warfare. The medieval networks understood that their most powerful weapon was simply truth, the exposure of hidden connections between respectable institutions and systematic brutalization. Their modern descendants have taken that lesson and amplified it using digital technologies that can reach millions of people instantly and preserve information in ways that make it nearly impossible to suppress. They're the ones behind many of the exposés that have revealed connections between major corporations and human trafficking operations. They're the source of leaks that have shown how law enforcement agencies and political institutions actively protect exploitation networks rather than combat them. They're the intelligence gatherers who provide information to journalists and activists, but they do it in ways that protect their identities and maintain their ability to continue operations. And they're winning. Slowly, gradually, often invisibly, but they're winning. The medieval networks predicted that their resistance would eventually destroy the systems they were fighting, and that prediction is coming true, not through dramatic revolution or sudden collapse, but through the slow erosion of legitimacy that happens when hidden truths become impossible to hide, when the contradictions between stated values and actual practices become too obvious to ignore. The toddler Me Too movement, the increasing awareness of human trafficking, the growing understanding of how technological platforms enable exploitation, all of these developments represent victories for resistance networks that have been working toward these revelations for decades or even centuries. The techniques they're using, the organizational structures that enable them, the strategic thinking that guides them, it all traces back to lessons learned in medieval brothels by women who understood that survival required more than individual endurance. But here's what should really terrify the people in power. The modern networks have capabilities that their medieval predecessors could never have imagined. Global communication systems that can coordinate actions across continents instantaneously. Digital technologies that can preserve and distribute information in ways that make suppression nearly impossible. Financial tools that can trace and disrupt money flows with unprecedented precision. Legal frameworks that, however imperfectly, provide some protection for whistleblowers and activists. The modern resistance networks are still fighting the same war, but they're fighting it with weapons that make medieval techniques look primitive by comparison. And they're fighting enemies who have also evolved, who have developed new methods of exploitation and control that are more sophisticated and more difficult to combat than anything their predecessors faced. The contemporary version of the medieval breaking process happens through digital manipulation, psychological profiling based on data harvesting, algorithmic systems that can predict and exploit individual vulnerabilities with surgical precision. The modern equivalent of medieval brothel districts exists in online platforms that can reach victims anywhere in the world, that can operate across national boundaries, that can hide behind layers of corporate structure and legal protection that medieval operators never had access to. But the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Systems of power that depend on the exploitation of vulnerable populations, resistance networks that emerge from those populations and develop the skills necessary to fight back. An eternal conflict between those who profit from suffering and those who refuse to accept it as inevitable. And that brings us to the question that's been lurking underneath this entire story. The question that every person who's listened to this narrative has to answer for themselves. Which side are you on? Because there is no neutral position in this conflict, no way to remain uninvolved or uncommitted. Every choice you make, every purchase decision, every political vote, every social media interaction, all of it either supports the systems of exploitation or contributes to the resistance against them. The medieval networks understood this better than their modern counterparts in some ways. They lived in a world where the lines were clearer, where the violence was more obvious, where the choice between complicity and resistance was easier to recognize. In the modern world, the systems of exploitation have become more sophisticated at hiding themselves, more effective at making their operations look legitimate, more successful at convincing people that participation is voluntary and resistance is unnecessary. But the descendants of those medieval networks see through the disguises, understand the continuities, recognize the patterns that connect medieval brothels to modern trafficking operations, that link the psychological techniques used to break individual women centuries ago to the mass manipulation systems that shape behavior today. They know that the war never ended because the underlying structures never changed. They just found new forms and new justifications. So when you go to sleep tonight, when you're lying in your comfortable bed in your safe house in your civilized society, remember this. Somewhere in the darkness, the descendants of those medieval resistance networks are still working, still gathering intelligence, still planning operations, still fighting a war that began in brothel basements and has continued for centuries, still working toward the complete transformation of a human society, still believing that systems built on exploitation can be destroyed and replaced with something better, and they're still winning one revelation at a time, one exposed connection at a time, one awakened consciousness at a time. The war they started in medieval Europe is approaching its endgame in the modern world, and the outcome will determine whether humanity's future is built on the foundation of exploitation that has characterized most of our history, or on something completely different, something that those broken women in medieval brothels could imagine but never live to see. The choice is yours. But choose quickly, because the women who started this war understood something that their modern enemies still haven't grasped, that systems based on lies and violence contain the seeds of their own destruction, and that truth, once unleashed, has a momentum that becomes impossible to stop. The medieval world ended not because of kings or armies or natural disasters, but because a group of disposed women refused to stay silent about what had been done to them. The modern world might end the same way, and whether that's a tragedy or a liberation depends entirely on which side of the eternal war you choose to join.